Oh my god, like and they're like, is it? They just shine a spotlight on me. I'm like, oh my god. Yeah. Oh my god, I'm so sorry. When did you start watching this? Yesterday. Last night. Yeah. It's so like I just like it. It's good. Like I feel like I don't watch a lot of TV shows. I haven't watched TV. Yeah, for real. I like sit down and like this is great. Yeah. Oh, right there. Yeah. I mean there is, but yeah, it's a whole thing.
All right. That's not working at all, is it? Hello. Oh, microphone. Hello. Hmm. All right. Is that microphone working at all over there? Okay, perfect. I cannot hear the echo. Usually in rooms, it's really echoey. All right. Let's get going if I can ever clip this on my belt. Okay, so welcome back. I mean, already we're done week 2 of the semester, right? Last day of week 2. 2 weeks down, 12 more to go, right? You're almost there, kind of, or something. It's week 2. We're at the end of week 2, and I'm already 3 weeks behind. So, it's been a good day. Okay, so obviously today we're going to keep going talking about our different generational cohorts, kind of what they looked like as young people, and how that affects them as they move through the life course. Okay, so starting with a question from me, kind of, except that's not how I spell my name. Okay, so this person asking, if the boomers were so progressive in the early days, why are politics so regressive now, especially if the boomers are more politically active now? To add on the previous question, if the boomers were so liberal in their prime, how come they tend to oppose and scrutinize Gen Z progressivism so radically? And I think this is principally, you kind of get stuck generationally. And you kind of see the same thing with Gen X as well. You're progressive for what was progress when you were young, but then as you get older, it kind of ossifies a little bit, right? It slows down and you stop accepting kind of whatever the next push to the next bit of progress is. I guess in some senses you have more to lose as you get older, right? You tend to get wealthier, you tend to get more established. And so the things that are established seem more valuable to you. And I think with the boomers, right, they were progressive on women's rights, they were progressive on gay and lesbian rights, but then at a certain point, that just kind of stops, right? And so whatever the next thing in terms of progress is, they're not as supportive. Okay, that's my explanation. Okay, I think we finished this slide. Yes, we finished this slide on Wednesday, 2 days ago. What was that day? Okay, and we talked, okay, yeah, we ended off on this slide because I was telling you at the end of last class how, if you are a woman, you probably owe a lot of the progress that, you've made socially, politically, economically, both to the birth control pill, which obviously in making it possible to separate sex and conception, at least to a degree, allowed you to control some aspects of your life that were much harder to control before, but also to the labor-saving devices that have taken a lot of the work that women used to do of social reproduction, right? Cooking, cleaning, mostly cooking and cleaning, and automated it, right? Put it into machines that do most of the work for you, and it freed up an enormous amount of time for women to go and pursue their economic interests outside the home outside of the domestic sphere. So, your Samsung is also part of women's liberation. So there you go. There we go. Okay. Individualism. So individualism, like I said, one of the trends we're going to see as we go through from the silence to Gen Z is generally growing individualism every generation, right? And each generation is going to get more individualistic than the last ones. And the boomers were probably where this starts in earnest, right? You see it a little bit with the silence, but the boomers, are much more individualistic. Now, part of this is affluence, right? People in more affluent societies tend to become more individualistic. The richer you get, the more individualistic you are, at least to an extent. So the boomers, their individuality, it starts out in a particular way, right? So it starts out in their, as they're going into the late 60s, right? The oldest of the boomers in the late 60s are coming into their late teens and 20s. And, through the 1970s, a lot of the focus is on things like rejecting rules set out by society. And so you see this, in the hippie movement, right? In the kind of the hippies, right? And the anti-war, in things like the free love. I was going to call it free sex, but it's actually free love, where it's like, yeah, have sex with everyone, experiment, no social obligations with regards to sex. Now, by the time they get to the 1980s, right, and you start to round into, the 30s and then into the 40s, right, for your baby boomers, especially in the oldest part of the cohort. One of the things that kind of shifts is that people stop worrying as much about this, and they start, on kind of quests of self-discovery. And so you get a boom in a lot of things, but in things like self-help literature, right? There's an explosion in self-help literature, discover who you truly are, express yourself. All of these things really boom in the 1980s. And, talk about the millennials a little bit here, because the millennials in large part are the children of the baby boomers. One of the things that happened, so late Gen X and then early millennials are very much the children of the baby boomers. And one of the things you get with the millennials is very much a focus on how much they're special as individuals, how unique everyone is. And it's a sort of outgrowth of this, right? Not only are the boomers doing their own self-discovery, but they're doing the self-discovery of their children, right? So they encourage their children in this same vein. And trust me, I lived through the 80s as a child. Every child of the 1980s was raised to think they were a special little snowflake, just so perfect and unique, and there's no one else just like you. Aren't you so wonderful and special? So there's definite downfalls to that, which is why when we get to the millennials, Twenge calls them, the narcissist. I wrote a book called The Narcissism Epidemic and Generation Me about the millennials. Okay, so funny point. Names tell us something, and the names that people choose for their children can tell us something really interesting, right, in terms of the values of different generational cohorts. And you can see a kind of shift happening, in how people pick the names of their kids, right? So if we go to the 1880s, right, and this will hold true to lesser and lesser extents as you go forward in history, but even for the silence, it's pretty standardized. In the 1880s, nearly half of boys were given 10 names, right? So 50% of boys would have been named probably some combination of Adam, Matthew, Mark, John, and some other biblical names for change, right? A lot of people named that way. Half of boys. 1 in 4 girls received one of the 10 most popular baby names, right? So yeah, a quarter of girls were getting exactly 10 names. And again, you can probably imagine that these are names like Anne, Mary, and some other. I can't remember all the female baby names as well. By the time you hit 100 years later, right? 100 years later, when the baby boomers start naming their kids, only 1 in 5 receives the most popular names. And since 2010, right, it's only 1 out of 14. And the list of names has gotten quite a bit different, right? And I'll tell you this, for late Gen Xers and millennials, one of the things that's happened has been a focus on really unique names and really unique spellings, right? Right? So you've got your Aiden. You've got your Aiden. You've got your Aiden. Anyway, I could keep going. There's I've seen probably 18 different spellings of the name Aiden. At a certain point, I had a bunch of friends who had Irish backgrounds. And so then it was Siobhan, so all sorts of crazy stuff, right? I do have a friend whose name is, whose baby's named Siobhan, right? I guess she's 10 now, but not really a baby. But names and the names you choose for your kids take on a different meaning. In 1880, it was about fitting in and being normal. In 1980, it becomes, your kid is supposed to have a unique name, something that expresses just who they are, right? Or your feelings of who they are. And you get sort of things like, my cousin Melissa, when she had her daughter, they refused to pick out names in advance, right? And the logic she had behind this was, when we meet her, we'll know her name, right? By the way, it took about 3 weeks after they had the baby to figure out the name and put it on the birth certificate, because it was well, shit, we didn't pick any names we liked out early, so I guess we're going to do it now. And it's much easier when you're not sleep deprived, trust me. Okay, so, but this is the kind of attitude, right? And my cousin's definitely a Gen Xer. That name is going to fit that child precisely, right? That's the sort of boomer, Gen X, millennial, Gen Z sort of way of naming children. Okay, so the boomers, as they move through life, again, not necessarily in youth, but as they have moved through life, they've struggled with mental health at 2 or 3 times the rate that the silents did at the same age. And this is held roughly true through their life course. It started in their college years and has persisted into their late 70s, right? So, I guess the oldest of the boomers now is going to be turning 78 this year, right? Born in 1946. My dad, who was born in 1947, turned 77 just a couple of days ago. Oh, sorry, 78? No, 78. Yeah, he turned 78. So I guess I'll be 79. So just a couple of days ago. Okay, suicide rates for boomers higher than the silents. And an American born in 1964, the last boomer year, was 35% more likely to take their own life than one born in 1935, right? So, huge differences in these generational cohorts. And this got even worse. Oh yeah, when they got into their in this 45 to 54 kind of middle-age demographic, deaths of despair really increased amongst the boomers, right? Now, deaths of despair is this really interesting sociological metric. So it counts deaths by 3 factors: suicide, overdose, and liver failure, right? So assuming that you drank yourself into, cirrhosis of the liver. This really popped amongst the white working class first, right? So white working class boomers were especially affected by these deaths of despair. But once they go onto that next age cohort, that 55 to 64 demographic, death rates for all boomers rose. despite the rates for, cancer and heart disease actually declining because of better medication. And these deaths of despair increased amongst all demographics of the boomers, right? So you went to, white working class, white middle class, black middle and upper classes, non-white Hispanics, right? All of them saw that rate rise. Now, Twenge suggests this is probably due to fewer stable relationships, less stable relationships, an increase in individualism, which caused people to be less integrated and lonelier. The boomers were one of the first generations to really check out of the institutions of kind of civic life, right? They're the ones who left the churches first, the bowling leagues, and all of that stuff. So they tend, and there's other things other than just churches and bowling leagues, but those are the ones that I'll just throw out there. There's not just those two things in society. Clubs and societies and all of these things, they were less integrated than the silents. And that has caused them to be, less integrated and lonelier than the silents before them. Now, again, we'll talk about this. I think we'll talk about this theme throughout the course, because for me, looking at the research that's out there on millennials and Gen Z, this has been one of the touchstones, right? As you get more individualistic, and with changes in technology, and we could talk about cable television, and then, mobile phones, social media. As these technologies have changed, more and more pronounced with each generational cohort. And when we get to Gen Z, they're spending less time with other people, less time in institutional settings, and we see big spikes in mental health issues, right? So the boomers, I think, are the leading edge. They're the ones who quit the institutions in major ways, or certainly, when it comes to their kids, the Gen Xers and the millennials encourage their kids to leave institutions in major ways or passed on the values that would lead them there. This has then bled into crises in mental health across the board. And we'll look at it, again, all through the course. I'm going to come back to this theme of institutional belonging because I think it matters. Okay, and I will say, because I've been rethinking things recently with regards to marriage, not my own. Socially, because I was contacted by an institution, let's say, that's interested in talking about why their rates of marriage have gone down significantly since the 1980s. So I get to go and do like a presentation for them, and they're going to pay me, and I'm like, sweet, I love it. So I've been rethinking this kind of question, and the boomers, another thing that they exit in major ways are marriages, right? The divorce rates really start to spike amongst the boomers, right? They exit marriage or they rethink marriage in really significant ways that are going to ripple through the subsequent generations, right? Gen X and millennials especially, because for the most part, Gen Z hasn't gotten married yet. And well, I mean, if the statistics tell me anything, probably unlikely that a large majority of you are going to. But we'll talk about that when we get to families. It's going to be super fun. I got some statistics. I got some theories. It's awesome. You'll all be so depressed. It'll be great. Okay. Just to clarify, in the 1880s, were boys being given 10 given names, or was there just basically 10 options? Oh, of course, there's many options, right? And like America in the 1880s is very much a kind of melting pot, right? You've got lots of different ethnicities kind of coming in, people from Italy, Ireland, Poland, Germany, coming from all over the place. And yet, what do they do to their kids? It's like, hello, I don't know what accent this is. Hello, I am from Russia. I will call my son Tom, right? Because they want to fit in, right? It's a whole different mentality, right? You will be Mark. Russian accent is so bad. Okay. So I think it's not that there's 10 given names. There's so many names, but people cue in on those ones that are socially acceptable. Do I think there's more reported mental health issues because it's more accepted? There's probably more things that people would have known about them as well. Okay, this is a common kind of thing. And when we get to Jonathan Haidt at the end of the course, this is something that Jonathan has had to contend with as well in his research. Now, the reason I think the answer to this is both yes and no, and it's a good question. There are certain metrics, especially that we can track, that are very objective and have been very objective for a long time. More accents, please. You got it. Howdy. Y'all are getting so many. No, I'm kidding. So this one here, right, are deaths of despair. All of these are, and I'm going to erase so I can recolor. Oh, I love this pen. It has an eraser on the back. It's beautiful. Okay, our suicide, right? Suicide is a very objective measure, right? Not susceptible to reporting errors. Why? Because governments have been tracking it for a long time, right? Anyone who takes their own life, the government records it as a suicide and has been for a very long time. Same thing with overdose, right? Overdose, because it's a medical death, similar, and cause of death on death certificates for things like liver failure. These are very objective measures. Now, that doesn't encompass, these deaths of despair don't encompass mental health broadly, but it is, I think, sort of an indicator that there's something going on, leading to, behaviors, right? There's life circumstances that are troubling that are leading to objectively measurable behaviors that are linked to mental health, right? Like, happy people that are well integrated, right? And you can go back to Durkheim's On Suicide for this. They don't do these things, right? They don't drink themselves to death, right? They don't overdose for the most part, right? There's exceptions, but for the most part, these are things that happen when there's big societal challenges going on to particular demographics, and they're very objective. So yeah, there's certainly, reporting bias. People are more willing to talk about it. I don't think that tells us the whole story, because I think there are really objective ways of measuring certain things going on that have definitely seen upward movement. And when we get to, you gotta wait to the end of the course for this, unfortunately. So we're talking like week 13, 14. I guess week 14 is 1 or 2 classes, so probably week 12, 13. Things like hospitalizations for self-harm, right? We've seen big spikes in this, especially amongst Gen Z. Increased suicide attempts, right? There's all sorts of metrics that are really objective that don't have anything to do with self-reporting that I think we can talk about, that paint a picture, but one that's very objective and not susceptible to reporting bias. Bless you, because you sneezed twice. Okay. If you ever sneeze and I don't say bless you, I'm sorry I missed you. I just got caught up in my own head. All right. Wow, 23 minutes. So let's talk Gen X. The cohort that I just barely missed. Sorry, I delight in this number for no particular reason, other than the fact that, so my sister was born in 1980, and the implication for her that she is a millennial is hateful to her. And so I always like to point out that everybody she's like, I am Gen X. And I'm like, nope. Gen X ended in 1975. You're a millennial, just like me. And she hates that because she thinks of millennials as narcissistic and lazy. And I'm like, well, I guess that's you then. You're narcissistic and lazy. I like to torment my sister as much as possible. Even though we're adults and we're both middle-aged, it's still fun. Okay, can you imagine why we don't get along? Okay, so Gen X. The first generation that's going to, for like pretty much the whole cohort, have television everywhere all the time, right? So for the silence, it was just coming in, but it wasn't, it distributed quickly. Not everyone had it. For the boomers, it was there. Most people had it. But people can often, like my dad, again, born in 47, and my mom, born in 51, both remember not having TVs and remember it being a big deal when their families got television, right? Now, they're older boomers. Certainly, the younger boomers would be similar to this. But for Gen X, everybody had a TV essentially since birth, right? And a lot of their experiences is, their parents using TV as a kind of babysitter for them. I have to, having a 5-year-old right now, I have to fully endorse this plan. TV as a babysitter is sometimes just a great thing. Okay, so often, and this is how Gen X often talks about itself, the last to have an analog rather than a digital childhood, right? So by the time, okay, I'll put it this way. Roughly speaking, the internet becomes a commercial product that anyone has enough money can buy right around 1995, 1996. It takes a while for it to distribute, right? It starts in the middle class, but by the time they get to 1995, your youngest, right, your absolute youngest here are kind of 16. Right? They're already kind of late adolescence, exiting adolescence. Most of this cohort is out of adolescence and well into adulthood before the internet becomes commonly available. So their whole childhood is analog, right? It's in the real world. It's with technologies that are not digital. The millennials will be the first generation, the first digital generation, but they're going to remember a time before the internet, for some of them. But Gen X is the first whose full childhood, right, was completely analog, right? They didn't really experience, for the most part, the digital world until adulthood, until well into adulthood. Okay, so they're the first generation not drafted, again, this is for the US, drafted into the military, right? This is following Vietnam. The draft was abolished. And basically, the U.S. switched to an all-volunteer army. So even though you have to register as a male when you turn 18 for selective service, so you could be drafted. They haven't run the draft in a long time. So they were not, the first generation that didn't experience sort of at least the risk of mandatory military service. They grew up during, the height of the Cold War. Right, so the Cold War kind of ends in 1988, but this period, kind of in the 60s and 70s, is probably the most tense period of the Cold War, where both the United States and the Soviet Union, come into frequent conflict as they both vie for control of the world. There's a few notable incidents, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis that really aggravates this. I can't remember the year. I want to say 66, but I could be wrong about that. I probably am. I don't remember the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But tensions are very high. And there is the genuine, hey, actually, this is kind of relatable. There's the genuine fear during the Cold War, and especially at its height, that a nuclear conflagration between the Soviet Union and the United States is potentially imminent, right? That nuclear war could break out any time. There's other incidents, right? The Russians, or the Soviets, shoot down an American spy plane over the Soviet Union and capture the pilot, even though he was supposed to commit suicide. He didn't. They capture the pilot, and this is a great tension. The Soviets shoot down a couple of airliners over the Sea of Japan accidentally, which causes rises in tension. It is a very tense time, and the kind of duck and cover drills, right, where in the event of a nuclear war, everybody was supposed to crawl under their desk to somehow protect themselves from a nuclear weapon. I don't know. Yeah, I think these things were to make people feel like you could do something rather than something that would actually work. This is the world that Gen X grows up in, right? Where nuclear annihilation is just around the corner. Okay. So, in a lot of ways, this is the last generation to experience a less fragmented culture. Now, the seeds of fragmented culture start in Gen X, right? Especially with things like cable television. you start to get a more fragmented culture. But for the most part, most of Gen X grows up in the 3-network era. With so that's ABC, CBS, and NBC, or NBC, being the 3 stations that most people have access to. In 1986, right, you get the addition of, in 86, you get the addition of Fox, not Fox News, just Fox. But prior to 86, basically everybody who's watching TV, and right, everybody has one, is watching shows on ABC, CBS, and NBC, which means people are essentially all watching the same things, right? So when you go to school on Monday morning, you can all talk about what was on TV over the weekend because you all watched the same stuff, right? You were all essentially watching the same television shows. So it's a very united culture with a lot of shared cultural touchstones. And if you talk to Gen Xers, right, this is probably a lot of your parents, they're going to remember a time of a very unified culture. Now, cable comes in, right? You get cable TV, and you get a proliferation of channels, right? More niche channels, more things like Nickelodeon, the Disney, or I guess in Canada, Super Channel, Family Channel, and these things come in and really diversify the space. But still, for most of them, they grow up where, everybody was watching MASH. Everybody was watching Cheers. Everybody was watching the same shows because you had a limited set of options. Okay. I colored on my thing. They're the first generation to experience video games, right? Principally starting in the 1970s, right? You start to get some really kind of basic video games like Pong. But in the 1980s, you get things like the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and then a little bit later, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis. God, I miss the Sega Genesis. I was so good at Sonic. I once completed all of Sonic 3 without dying once, at which point I concluded this game was too easy and I never played it again. But I spent a lot of time playing Sonic 3 as a kid, let me tell you. Right, so first generation to grow up with video games. Lots of them, right? And they proliferated through this period. Now, they're not online, right? None of these games are online. It's all you get the console, you play it at home, or you go to an arcade and you play it with your friends. Okay, probably the first generation who experienced the really high divorce rates that started in, younger silence and older boomer parents, right? Who had, some of the children in Gen X. So divorce becomes a reality for a lot of them. They see their parents go through divorces. They're the children of divorce. Okay. Hang on, I'm going to erase this. So much fun. I love it. And they are the first and last of what's called the latchkey kids, sort of. So what does this mean? So because they're the children of that tail end of the silence and the baby boomers, they are the kids whose a lot of their parents are working, including their mothers, right? So they get off of school and they come home by themselves. And there's a kind of lagging social infrastructure. You don't have a lot of daycares, right? There's not a ton in terms of after-school programs. That infrastructure doesn't exist yet. Where there's care, it's often domestic, right? Maybe you're staying at a friend's house, or your parents have found like what you would call now a day home, but really was just like someone to watch you after school that your parents paid, right? This was kind of normal. But for a lot of these kids, what they did, starting very young, as young as like I saw this about Gen X the other day on social media. They're like, we were the generation that, when you were 5 years old, you got a house key. True, right? Because they were coming home from kindergarten and letting themselves back into the house. We're the kids who learned how to cook our family meals at 7. True, but also bad. Not great. But it was parents were working. and they were balancing having children and working, essentially by letting their kids come home, let themselves in, and probably, turn on the TV and watch a crap ton of TV after school. So you didn't have out of school care, but you had, the after school special, which were basically TV shows aimed at teaching moral lessons to kids, like don't do drugs, which would air when? After school, right? Obvious, it's in the name. So these are, now, what happens, with why I say the first and last of the latchkey kids. There were obviously, with the boomers whose parents worked, who were also kind of in this space. And millennials, it wasn't necessarily that none of them had this right. But beforehand, right, you had a lot more mothers at home all the time. And afterward, you had a lot more daycares and after-school programs that start for the millennials, right? The social infrastructure starts to catch up to kind of changes. Okay, so, but this is a generation that gets a lot of independence. Do I have this on? I can't remember. Oh, yes. Sorry, I was going to ruin what's on this slide. But I won't do that now, because I'll talk about it on this slide. How am I doing for time, by the way? Oh, I got lots of time. It's amazing. I'm so good at my job. No, I'm kidding. I'm just joking. Oh, well, thank you. I get too excited sometimes, and I lose track of time. All right, so marriage, sex, and children, not necessarily in that order. So one of the things that comes from, coming home, there's no kind of after-school supervision. So how to put this politely? Gen X, they have sex early, right? So when we say they had a short childhood, they're given a lot of responsibility, and they transition into sort of certain adult activities really, really quickly, right? So the age at which they have sex is much younger than it was for any other generation. So they have a short childhood and a long adolescence, right? Now, part of this is, yes, when you get left, when your parents don't show up until 6 o'clock at night, and you have every minute from when you got off of school until your parents show up, you get into trouble. Having your, once you hit adolescence, you invite, your object of affection over to your house to hang out after school. And, you're sitting on the couch watching TV, and suddenly, stuff happens. If you can imagine, right? Kissing and other things. Well, I'll let you fill in the details. So now the Gen Xers, I'm still talking boomers. Marriage, sex, and children, right? All still happen. They're still pretty likely to get married. Sex and children, but not necessarily in that order, right? So for, if you were a boomer, or like silent or a boomer, you're much more likely to go in this progression, right? 1, 2, 3. For Gen X, sometimes it was like, 3, 1, 2. Oh no, well, sorry, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1. Maybe 2, 1, 3, right? I've created a code that I now have to keep track of, right? They mixed it up a lot more, and especially sex, right? Not something they were as likely to wait for until marriage as any generation before, right? Okay. They also tended to marry, and they start this trend, I guess they continue this trend, they reverse this trend from our silence. It had been reversing for the boomers, and they carry it forward the next step. They married later than any previous generation, right? So 25 was the average age at first marriage for women, 27 for men. And this is going to get higher and higher as we move forward in our generational cohorts. By the time we reach millennials and Gen Z, we're talking, for men, it's like 31, 32, and they're like 28, 29 for women, right? So it starts to get much later. Okay. So this is a fun one, right? Early boomer women had sex for only about 2 years before they got married. Gen X women, on the other hand, went 7 years between losing their virginity and walking down the aisle. Right, so they had a much longer period of sexual experimentation than the generations before them had had. Right, so they were experimenting, having sex young, getting married later. So if we're thinking the average age at first marriage is 25, that probably and there's 7 years between losing their virginity, so you're probably talking a good chunk of them losing their virginity around 18, but some good sense or a good amount of them losing it well before that. Okay, so that's a big thing for Gen X, right? This gap starts to widen and it becomes much more normal, sex outside of marriage. Okay, and children are uncoupled from marriage in major ways. In 1960, 1 in 20 children were born to unwed mothers. It's 1 in 6 by 1980 and 1 in 3 by 1993, right? So fully a third of children are born to mothers who are unmarried. Now, a lot of those women would have been cohabiting with their romantic partners. That starts to become more normalized as well. But this one's interesting. It's a fun little stat. The age of mothers at the birth of first child dipped below the age of first marriage for the first time, right? So for a majority of women, right, they're having their first child before they get married. So they flip this kind of social script that was normal for pretty much every generation before, right? That you have, you get married, then you have children. Well, for a good chunk of Gen X, it was like, well, the children were probably the what brought about the marriage in some cases. Okay. So, continuing this trend from the boomers, right? Because everything has a sort of cultural continuity. Nothing ever just ends. Loving yourself, and self-love becomes a big trend for Gen X. And again, I'm sort of like in a weird spot culturally because, I'm born in 1982. So I'm kind of, again, kind of tail end of Gen X. Sometimes people call where I'm at the Zennials because we're, I have much more in common with Gen X than younger millennials, like those born in like 1994. I'm like, oh, you're a strange creature. And they think the same of me, right? Self-esteem is such a big part of kind of Gen X and early millennial kind of upbringing, right? And I'm going to blame one particular street for this. I think this street was responsible for it all. That's right, Sesame Street. If the millennials are narcissists, it's freaking Big Bird's fault, right? And Gen X as well, right? So the idea, that self-esteem is really important definitely changes. Okay, so in the early 1950s, right, 12% of teens agreed with the statement, "I am an important person." By the late 1980s, 80% of teens, more than 6 times as many, claimed they were important, right? That's about that's a massive cultural shift, right? Just unbelievable in terms of a change in attitudes, right? Everybody now is Precious Snowflake who thinks they're super important. All right, it's all Big Bird's fault. We should have listened to Oscar the Grouch. He tried to warn us. All right. So this chart, super fun, right? Use of the words self-focus and self-esteem in American books, 1950, to 2019, really low. And then Gen X comes into the mix, right? So self-esteem, and it just absolutely shoots up. It'll never quite hit the heights of where it ends up for millennials. And then self-focus, again, it starts very low for Gen X and then kind of trundles its way up and then absolutely spikes for millennials, right? So that's where she's going to call us the narcissist generation or Generation Me. Okay. Do I have time? Yes, I'm going to do it. We're gonna end Friday on a high point. So Gen X is, in a lot of ways, the culmination of what had, up till then at least, been a building desire for unabashed materialism. And one of the things that Twenge points out, and I think this is really, really interesting because we're still living in this world now, life goals shifted from intrinsic, right? Where what people wanted, and say, especially out of, say, so what is this? Percent of incoming college students consider certain life goals important to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, right? 1960s, you start. Why did you go to college? You did it. 85% of them said it was about developing a meaningful philosophy of life, and that absolutely tanks, right? Like, screw that. I want stuff, right? So being financially well off, was less than half. And by the time you reach, into Gen X, you're basically at about 75% of people are like, I want to go to college because I want to be rich, right? And it's like, develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Forget about that. Life meaning is about having stuff. Okay, so if you wanted to plot another thing that goes, in the same kind of line, interest in the humanities would have gone like and fallen off to the point that college administrators don't care about it anymore. Sadly, I will say. Okay, so it goes from extrinsic to intrinsic, right? What do people want out of life? They want fame, they want image, they want money, right? Not a meaningful philosophy of life or helping others or community. Intrinsic things, it's, I want to be famous, right? I want to be Mr. Beast. It's great. Don't be Mr. Beast. No further comment on Mr. Beast or any of the influencers that are online. Okay, college students in Gen X, much less likely to say developing a meaningful philosophy of life was important, and much more likely to say being financially well off, right? And this trend has only accelerated for Gen Z. And we'll see it when we talk about jobs, right? We talk about Gen Z. Do you know what the number one job that Gen Z youth say they want is? Can anyone take a guess? Influencer, right? Because it combines all of these extrinsic things: fame, money, image, right? You can get all of them as an influencer, right? So I think, this trend very much continues for millennials and Gen Z. Okay. Would I be able to generalize Twenge's work to other cultures, or is this strictly Americans, Canadians? So I think we see similar trends in Europe, right? Europe has seen similar kind of cultural trends. Western Europe, right? Societies that are a little bit more distant from us, in Asia, in say Eastern Europe, it's a little bit less the case. But I think we very much see those kind of cultural trends starting in America and then sort of taking over the world, like Americans do. They don't say they're doing it, except Donald Trump. He's pretty obvious about it. But mostly Americans just take over the world without actually telling you they're doing it. You're seeing this happen, all over the world now. And it takes a little while. There's a little bit of a cultural lag, but it's what starts in America ends up everywhere. All right, was this rise of self influenced by the postmodern turn, where identity and difference overrides objective truth and ideology? I think you see some of this, but what I'll say about that is you don't really see, the postmodern turn really catching culturally until well into the 1990s, right? Postmodernism as an idea probably has its heyday in the late 90s and early 2000s as a real kind of cultural movement. So it's a little bit later. Why did I ask myself this question? I don't know. That's not how I spell my name. Okay. So yeah, people are goofing on that's okay. At least you're being mature about it. My SOS 100 students were being babies about it and posting like poop jokes, and I had to take away their toys and turn off the Slido for a class. I'm like, okay, if you're gonna be stupid, then we're turning this off. Anyway, but yeah, that's a funny one. I think this is coming, but you won't see it until you get to the millennials, right? Gen X is not postmodern in the way millennials are. All right, we're out of time. We'll see you on Monday. That was fun. I had fun. What's that?
The name was spelled differently, but it was like a breakfast, like you say.
Yeah.
So at least it's
It's all good. That's actually a funny one, right? And I always, yeah, have a great one. Oh. Jenna, how are you?
Good, and you?
I'm all right. I'm having a good time. I like this class.
It's very interesting. I was wondering if you know why there was that sudden shift from intrinsic to extrinsic. I tried to ask on Slido, but my phone wasn't loading.
Okay.
Like, did it just happen? Like, that's so odd to me.
It's a big set of cultural shifts.
Okay.
So there's a lot of things going on, right? And like any kind of historical period, you've got so many kind of competing social and cultural interests. I would say part of it is, a religious decline, right? You have a much greater focus on just kind of material wealth, happiness. You also have that kind of post-war affluence, right? Growing and growing. And, as people get richer and richer, they start to associate happiness more and more with stuff, right?
Okay.
Changes in focus in education play a role too, like especially after 1957, when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite. The Americans go through a kind of big panic where they retool their education system, and especially they kind of try to start shifting people away from the humanities, the humanities especially, into math, science, and engineering, right? Which themselves are much more materially focused, and kind of denigrate things like the classics, right?
Yeah.
And learning Shakespeare, right? And it becomes much more, we need to beat those dirty Ruskies,
Yeah.
in the space race and all over the planet. So lots of things are colliding to kind of cause that shift. I think the breakdown in kind of community as well,
Yeah.
right, is starting to bite. You're starting to see people be like, well, where am I going to be happy? Well, my parents are pretty rich and they seem to be doing good, or those people are rich.
Okay, so there wasn't like a big, because when I saw that, my first thought went to
times were so good before. We got to get back to the good times. The good times were when, you could afford a house and a car. And wow, that sounds so contemporary. What is going on?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I was just curious.
Yeah. And so cultures are so complex, right? It's rarely one thing. You've got these overlapping cultural forces all kind of hitting at once. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Have a great weekend. Hello.
Hi. You mentioned on Wednesday that you would be able to explain to me how to answer those like open-ended questions.
Of course. Let me just ask before I do that, Marie-Pierre, do you have something quick, or do you need to?
No, honestly, I kind of forgot my question.
Okay.
I was trying to think about it, but then I forgot it.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'll figure it out eventually.
I'll come see you in the hall after I'm done, and maybe you'll remember by then.
Probably, maybe. Honestly, that would be probably a good idea. Let me look at my notes.
Sure, sounds good. All right, let me pull up. Oh, I better stop streaming. Jeez, I'm streaming my answer.